We are through 2 weeks of Cincinnati Bengals training camp, and now is a better time than any to give our too early 53-man roster predictions.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to...
Jake's trying to power through. Welcome into Locked On Bengals. We are totally keeping that in. Thank you so much for making us your first listen and following wherever you get your podcast, subscribing on YouTube. And we're together if you're watching on YouTube,
Unfortunately,
which is awesome because we're not at the stadium today. We're in the Rapien home studio. So I get to put my hand on Jake's shoulder, my arm on Jake's shoulder, because he's much, much shorter than me. And Jake, you wanted to do a 53-man roster projection. There's no time like the present with the Bengals off today.
and that's what we will get into, including the starter battles still up for grabs and where those bubble battles are. And
Bubble battles.
it's a pretty big bubble this year, and we'll discuss where those bubbles are, those position groups in question. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs, who helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. You can post your job for free right now at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. Terms and conditions apply. And James, this is a 53-man roster that to me has between like 45 and 47 guys locked in at this point in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And then that leaves, 8 to 10 players on the bubble. You can put more players on the practice squad. You can put more veterans on the practice squad than you used to be able to do. And so where do you want to start when we discuss this 53-man breakdown?
Yeah, I think first things first, let's start at the top and kind of guys that we think are locks are going to make it or are battling for key spots or key contributing roles and not necessarily starters. We can get into that coming up, but just looking overall at this 53-man roster, I think the Bengals, and just looking at this team throughout camp, the Bengals are deeper in spots that we're not used to them being deep in, and maybe a little shallower in spots that we're used to them having a lot of options and having multiple guys that they believe in. And so it is interesting because I do think when we get between now and the end of the show, there are going to be some familiar faces that may be on the outside looking in or maybe on the bubble as we go through this process.
Yeah, I think there's some very clear ones, like they're going to keep 2 quarterbacks. I don't think there's any qualms about that. You take one step over, you look at running backs, and you already have questions.
You're talking about Rocky Lombardi as a lock, right?
Of course.
Okay.
That'll be Jake Browning as the second quarterback and Joe Burrow, of course, as the starter. We haven't
You're just saying that
seen
because your name is Jake.
we haven't seen anything from the other guys to suggest that they will make a roster. I don't think the Bengals are inclined to carry 3 quarterbacks, and I don't even know if the practice squad quarterback is currently on the team. Maybe, but it might be similar to last year where they end up going external for a practice squad quarterback after we get through the preseason. Like I said, once you get to running back, for me, that's where questions begin immediately. Do they decide to keep a 4th guy? Is the 3rd guy on the roster right now if Samaje Perine doesn't make that roster in Denver? Is that a conversation the Bengals are seriously having about that 3rd running back spot? Zach Moss and Chase Brown locked in, of course, and that's a starting role. That's one of those starting roles that I think is still up in the air a little bit, as far as you can say starting role for the running back that we think will still have a large committee component, even if we think one of these guys will be a quote unquote lead back. But I have a hard time seeing 4 running backs making the team this year. It would have to be strong special teams considerations. They would have to be giving something else up at another position where there are more difficult decisions in my mind to make. And who's to say that they can't get one of these guys if they choose to go with 3 to the practice squad anyway?
I think that's the argument, is even if Travion Williams and Chris Evans show out, push one of these undrafted guys they signed, push, let's say Noah Cain or Elijah Collins has a really good preseason in training camp. And there's been nothing that really pops off for those guys camp wise, but maybe starting Saturday things change. You sure you can't get that guy to the practice squad? Are you sure? Are you willing to move on from a tight end and go short there when we're seriously thinking that they could consider 5 guys there? Are you willing to move on from Shedrick Jackson at wide receiver, or move on from one of these offensive linemen and keep 9 instead of 10? That's when it gets tough. You're going short with quarterback. I agree with Jake, even though I was making fun of Jake, praising Jake. But yeah, Jake Browning's the second quarterback. That's that. So there's going to be 2 quarterbacks and I think 3 running backs. And I would be willing today, and as we record this, it is Tuesday, August 6th in the morning, to lock that in. 3 running backs. Now, could all hell break loose and they get multiple running backs they like on the waiver wire? Something crazy happens? Sure, something unforeseen could happen. But for me, looking at this roster, I think 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, you could lock it in. Is it Travion Williams or is it Chris Evans? I think Travion has a clear lead, but could Chris Evans overtake him? There's a chance. I think it's unlikely, but there's a chance.
Yeah, you never say never. And with all of these discussions that we're working through today, it's all based on what we've seen through 2 weeks of camp. And the acknowledgement needs to be made. And maybe we should have said this right up front, but we're pretty close to the upfront part of the discussion. The games are going to change things immediately. The games are going to change who's practicing with whom in these 11-on-11 periods. And some of the names we're going to talk about, the Matt Lee backup center battle, for example. Perhaps Matt Lee goes out there and has a great first preseason game, and then he works in with the number 2s a little bit more in 11s. We haven't really seen much from any players outside of the first 2 groups in 11-on-11s, at least in the last few days. And so those 3rd and 4th units, those 3rd and 4th stringers, are getting a lot of individual work. They're getting their positional work in, but they're not getting a whole lot of 11-on-11, even 7-on-7 work so far. And with the game coming up, if they can prove their mettle in the game, you could see those rotations change. And then all of these predictions could change in the future as well. But as of today, what we've seen from the Bengals running back so far, I'm on the same page with you there. I think Travion Williams has a clear lead from a running back perspective, from a special teams perspective, even though he and Chris Evans have worked in very similar roles in both of those units. I would say that Travion Williams, based on both previous years and this year, has a clear lead in that conversation. And where things get, I think, a little tricky are when you get to some of the skill positions. You're talking about potentially keeping 5 tight ends, and then the decision of, is it 6 receivers? Because there's 6 very clear receivers that we can say are going to make the team, 6 guys that I would consider roster locks. And then the 7th spot, Shedrick Jackson getting a lot of praise, working in with the 1s at times, certainly rotating in with the 2s, getting a lot of work in 11-on-11s, and has made some big plays throughout camp. If he carries that performance into the preseason, that is a clear bubble guy for me, that if he impresses them enough, well, does he force his way onto the roster? Do they feel comfortable exposing him to waivers and getting him to the practice squad? That would be the receiver that I would have my eyes on this year.
For sure. I think he's firmly in the mix of, can he force his way onto the roster? And there are guys like that. I think Tanner McLaughlin is the guy like that. I know a lot of people would say Tanner Hudson. I think McLaughlin is in that position right now. And I know he's a 6th rounder, and I know they value him and all those things. But from what I've seen from Eric All, we know Gesicki and Sample are locks. And I think Hudson's a lock. He has Joe Burrow's trust. Jake Browning saying he always gets open. He's always open. So these quarterbacks trust him, believe in him. Tough for me to see that path. So it's McLaughlin just winning the 5th job and forcing them to keep 5, which then directly impacts, I think, whether or not they can keep 7 and whether or not they keep number 12 around, Shedrick Jackson, who Joe Burrow mentions as much as any receiver.
Yeah.
Literally goes out of his way, mentions him more than Jamar and T. Now, he's asked about Jamar and T more, so he talks more about those 2 guys. But when you say, all right, who's been standing out, or who stood out this offseason, or who's made leaps, it made a leap, Shedrick is always mentioned multiple times this offseason. So certainly someone to keep an eye on. I think there's a little bit more on tight end, certainly a little bit more on wide receiver as well. Let's continue the conversation. Shocker. James wants to continue to talk about wide receivers. We will do that coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is the app you need right now. And you need it because maybe you want to go to Thomas Rhett at Great American Ballpark later this month, and You're jealous of everyone that saw Luke Combs in concert this past weekend. Well, Gametime is the app that's going to get you into the live event you want to go to. Easy, painless. All you have to do is download the app and take advantage of their all-in prices, their panoramic views from your seat. They have a lowest price guarantee as well. And maybe you're late to the party and maybe an event has already started. Maybe the Reds game has already started. I know they're out of town. They'll be back next week. You can still, up to an hour after the event has started, get tickets with Gametime. So check out Gametime today. Take advantage of all of the benefits that come with their all-in pricing and download the Gametime app. Create an account. Use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed.
You want to stay on the topic of skill players? I think that's fair.
Yeah.
We have two receivers locked in as starters in T. Higgins and in Jamar Chase. And right now, it looks like Andrei Iosivas will be the lead, at least leading candidate to take the majority of the snaps at wide receiver 3 in the slot or wherever that is. And that could still be a committee. I think Charlie Jones has shown enough to show that he deserves some opportunities to get on the field. I think Trenton Irwin continues to be the savvy veteran that has the quarterback's trust, talking about Tanner Hudson the same way. So we will still see, I think, a bit of a rotation there. But I think that the top 6 guys locked in, Jermaine Burton obviously making the team. He has, I think, a little bit of a ways to go to get more comfortable in the offense and normal rookie learning curve stuff for Jermaine Burton, who has certainly made his own share of plays, but I think is probably behind those guys right now in terms of getting up to speed and feeling like he can play fast. The preseason will be an opportunity for him to show that he can do those things. But you mentioned Tanner Hudson. He continues to work with the ones, and you continue to see the rookies, Eric Hall, Tanner McLaughlin, working behind the other tight ends, the veteran tight ends on this team. And so when we talk about where those roster decisions are, exposing Tanner Hudson, like cutting Tanner Hudson doesn't necessarily strike me as a very obvious plan, like you said. And then you have to figure out how many receivers you want to keep. I do think it might actually be tough for Shedrick Jackson to make the team, in all fairness, just because how many receivers are you going to have active? How many special teams roles do you have? Is there a reason to have that, 7th receiver active? And what's the difference between, a Shedrick Jackson or a Kendrick Pryor or a Kwame Lassiter in the minds of the Bengals brass in terms of guys that you can put on the practice squad and call up when and if you need to?
Yeah, I think there has been a gap there with Shedrick.
Yes.
But it needs to be really the opposite. He needs to just be right there on Trenton Irwin's heels and Charlie Jones's heels and all of these guys. And he's had a couple drops in camp. And I don't think he's been as good as Charlie or Trenton or Andre. Jermaine, obviously, like Jake said, making the team, still figuring life out in the NFL. Doesn't mean he's not going to make an impact. I think Jermaine Burton will make an impact this year, but figuring life out with a room that is just motivated, has a lot to prove. I mean, think about it. Jamar Chase is Jamar Chase, and he's going to have a lot to prove when he signs his deal, or if he doesn't. There's going to be a lot on the line this year. T. Higgins, biggest year of his career by far. Andrei Iosivas, Charlie Jones, eager to show that they belong and that they should and get regular snaps week in and week out on offense. And Trenton Irwin has something to prove, it seems like, week in and week out, period, because everyone kind of forgets about him. And he's listed as a starter on the Bengals depth chart, and I do think he'll be a major factor early this year. So it's an uphill climb for Shedrick. It just is, because they're 6 deep. Like Jake said, 6 locks, and not locks because, Charlie Jones was a draft pick last year. Locks because he's been that good in camp, not just on offense, but a key special teamer as well. And so Shedrick's going to have to show that and earn his roster spot. I do think it's possible, but on the likely unlikely, I think it's more unlikely. In I would say 7 times out of 10, at least at this point, that the Bengals will likely stick with 6 wide receivers and try to sneak some of these guys, the Kendrick Pryors, Kwame Lassiters, and even Shedrick Jackson, onto the practice squad.
Yeah, and that might make room for them to just comfortably keep 5 tight ends. When I was going through my own 53-man exercise, on Wednesday. What day is it? Monday. It's not even Wednesday yet. When I was doing this yesterday on Monday, we got to
What day is it?
Tuesday, I think.
How's your knee feeling?
It's feeling good.
All right.
We're gonna make it.
Powering through.
I was able to get to a point where I was at 52 players with 5 safeties and 5 tight ends. So if that's a direction they want to go, they could. That could mean, though, going lighter on offensive line than they have in recent years. And I think that's the final stop here on offense, where there are, in my mind, 7 locks right now. There are 5 veterans in Orlando Brown, Cordell Volson, Ted Karras, Alex Kappa, and Trent Brown. Rookie Amarius Mims is certainly making the team. Another veteran, Cody Ford, certainly making the team. And that's where it gets interesting. Right now, it would be Trey Hill. If the regular season was starting tomorrow, I truly believe that Trey Hill would be the other guy, the next guy up, the interior offensive lineman backup with some positional flex to play the guard or center positions. And then it might be Jackson Carman as the 9th guy because they've been working him as a backup tackle at both positions. He's obviously played guard in the past, so he does have that positional versatility. But after those top 8 guys, I'm not so convinced that there are definitely 9 offensive linemen making this roster. They could certainly go that way just to have the extra player available to them, not exposing them to waivers, not taking any risks. They're having the positional versatility that they're familiar with and the player that's familiar with their system on the team. But once I get past 8, and that means Cody Ford is a backup flex spot, Amarius Mims, Trent Brown, whichever one of those guys is backing up, and then a backup interior guy. And I think Trey Hill is the backup center that has a guard flex right now for this team. It gets really interesting. And to me, everyone after that, and including Trey Hill, to be fair, I think he's still on the bubble, is fighting for 1 or 2 roster spots.
Well, you're right. There are 7 locks. I think Cody Ford is in that mix. I mean, he's lined up. He's played tackle. He's played guard in camp. And so I think they're comfortable with him and his versatility and what he brings. After that, the Trey Hill thing is just, it's so interesting because he was clearly their 3rd center last year. And Max Sharping was ahead of him. They didn't bring back Max Sharping. They go get Matt Lee with the 7th round pick. Matt Lee not working in on team drills right now. How does he fare this Saturday? I mean, that's how up in the air it is. I agree. If there was a game tomorrow, they would trust they would trust Trey Hill, but very much up in the air. I think another guy in Jackson Kirkland could earn a job, and he's another one to keep an eye on. And it could come down to Jackson Kirkland, Jackson Carman, and Deontay Smith, who's been nicked up and not practicing the past couple of days. Something to keep an eye on. It feels like every camp that happens, he needs those preseason reps. And I think that's what you can say about Jackson Carman. I make fun of him and I rip that pick a lot and take little shots at it, but he has been relatively durable. I think I don't want to say they're comfortable with him at both tackle spots, but they'll put him at both tackle spots if and when needed. And obviously he's played a little bit of guard too. So I would give Jackson the edge right now as in Carman, but no one's going to feel good about it. We're all making the Jackson Carman face as you're listening or watching. I'm doing it here if you're not watching on YouTube. So we'll see.
Yeah, that is it's going to be interesting, and we'll see how that changes through the preseason games. I think that's a spot where some of these linemen down the depth chart will have the opportunity to work into more 11-on-11 reps, get more involved in practices the rest of the way. This first preseason game is, I think, a really big deal for a lot of these roster bubble players who are trying to earn more of an opportunity to show what they can do in practices. And so once we're through the offense here, and we've talked about a lot of guys that we think are on the bubble. There's only one starting job that you could consider on the offense really up for grabs. I mean, right tackle, certainly one where I think that will continue to be a competition. But as far as guys that are unknown, and I would give Josevach a clear edge here, there's that competition left at wide receiver. And that's pretty much it on offense. The offense's starting unit and depth chart, I would say, in my mind, pretty set for this team right now. Not a whole lot of decisions near the top of that roster on offense, but once you get to some of those depth positions, I do think it gets quite interesting. Coming up next, we have another side of the ball to talk about. We also might have a specialist battle or two to talk about. We will get to the rest of this roster to finish the show next.
Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process easier and quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring, and you should too. At linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
James, we spent some time in the last couple of days talking about what's going on with the Bengals' defensive trenches and the potential need to go sign a veteran there. That being said, I think that there aren't a ton of decisions to be made when it comes to the depth chart when you start with the Bengals defense up front.
Yeah, I mean, let's just go over the locks quickly. And Cam Sample would have been a lock. And so that opens up a spot, certainly. But Sam Hubbard, Sheldon Rankins, BJ Hill, Trey Hendrickson, lock. Miles Murphy, lock. Chris Jenkins, lock. McKinley Jackson, lock. Zach Carter, feels like a lock. I mean, it does. I would say at this point. And so
he continues to work with the ones is probably where most of that is coming from. He's still working ahead of the rookies, and the rest of the depth on the interior defensive line has missed a bunch of practices. And so I don't think there's really been a significant challenge to Zach Carter, unfortunately, despite if you go look at our lads or go look at the Bengals.com depth chart, you're going to see a bunch of defensive tackles on the roster. That challenge just hasn't amounted to much yet.
And Joseph Osai with Cam Sample's injury, lock.
Yep.
And I thought he entered camp, and this is how things change. This is a perfect example. I thought he was on the bubble entering camp. Not firmly on the bubble, not like Jackson Carman, but certainly someone that had to show it. Stay healthy, show it. And so far, so good, knock on wood. Hopefully that continues. I'm going to keep rhyming. The point is, though, is Osai now walks in, and I think that given how he's practiced, given the fact that he's familiar with this system and the odds that the Bengals go out and get a guy, who knows? Maybe they do by the time you hear this or see this, but Osai to me feels like a lock, Jake. And so we're talking about Dominique Davis, Travis Bell, Jeff Gunter, Jay Tufele, Cedric Johnson, Justin Blazek. Like, those are the type of guys we're talking about at the back end fighting to impress the Bengals and 31 other teams, not the Osais of the world or guys like that I think now the Bengals are going to be relying on to a much greater degree with Cam Sample out.
And you mentioned Jay Tufele in that list. Yeah.
Yep.
To me, they're two significant bubble guys, and I would say Cedric Johnson has a lead to be the fifth defensive end if they want to keep a fifth defensive end, which I think they probably do. But then on the defensive interior, we haven't seen a whole lot of Jay Tufele in the last few days at camp, and I think that it will take an effort for him to get onto this roster because they've drafted two guys, and we'll see what McKinley Jackson's injury was on Monday. Hopefully that's nothing too serious, and if it is, that opens the door for either a veteran acquisition or one of these defensive linemen who have missed some time to make an impression in preseason games and earn a spot on the roster. But yeah, Joseph Osai to me is fully locked at this point. And something would have to go off the rails for that to change. He's been perhaps the most impressive defensive player to me in the practices I've watched so far. And that's working with the ones against Orlando Brown. And in case you're curious about where he's getting those reps, it's not coming against backup tackles and undrafted free agents and Jackson Carman, the guys working with the twos. It's coming against the first team. And that was highlighted by a run stop for a safety on Monday. And so I think Osai has made a pretty significant impression throughout training camp. And obviously that needs to carry into games, and that will need to continue throughout camp. And that's the caveat for all of these things. But right now, I would say Joseph Osai, especially in the wake of Cam Sample's unfortunate injury, is pretty secure on this roster. So that's probably 10 defensive linemen. If we throw Zach Carter and Cedric Johnson into the mix, and it does seem like Cedric Johnson is currently in the lead, but that could certainly change if they are interested in keeping a fifth edge player.
Yeah, I think that it's almost the same where you list all these locks and there's 9. And can Cedric Johnson or one of these other guys say, hey, you have to put me on? You can't expose me to waivers. You can't risk it. It's not worth it. And Johnson being the draft pick, in an ideal world, that would work. But who knows? Maybe Jeff Gunter emerges. Maybe, man, it would be nice if one of these interior guys, it really would be.
They got to practice.
I agree. And that's whether it's Dominique Davis, Travis Bell, Devonta Maxwell still on the PUP list. So
we'll see if we can see some of these guys later this week or in a preseason game that would obviously be beneficial for their cause and would help the Bengals to sort things out. Let's get to linebacker here quickly. To me, there are 4 locks right now, and I don't know if they keep a 5th. We'll see if one of the undrafted guys makes a big enough impression or one of the veterans that has been around. Most of the veterans, I think, have been around since last year.
Yeah, I mean,
in the linebacker unit. But after Logan Wilson, Jermaine Pratt, Joe Bachie, and Akeem Davis-Gaither, do they keep a 5th? I am not so convinced.
I think it's up to Devin Harper and or Shaka Hayward earning that special team spot. And it's worth noting that Devin Harper stuck last year because of special teams. They claimed him from Dallas, and he was there and came in and was a part of it. And I think they liked what he brought. And so can he continue that? Can he be a factor with this new kickoff role? I think so. And so that's the path, I would say, for a 5th linebacker, because from a defensive standpoint, no doubt, Pratt, Wilson, Davis-Gaither, Bachie, they have trust in all 4 of those guys. They believe in those guys, but they're going to need a 5th that they believe in, even if it's on the practice squad. They're going to need a 5th that they believe in within the organization. So we'll see how they go. I would say if there is a threat, it would be Devin Harper at this point.
And they would need to figure out special teams and the new kickoff return, the potential for needing bigger bodies there. That's something that Jeff Hobson recently wrote about in reference to Cedric Johnson, actually, as a big guy who can run. And maybe that's the path to Cedric Johnson making the team there and maybe not having a 5th linebacker. We'll see how that shakes out. We'll see if any linebackers beyond those first 4 really make an impression, or if there is something else that forces the Bengals to consider keeping another guy. Let's go to corner, where, again, I think 5 locks right now at cornerback. The starters, I would say, as of today, Cam Taylor-Britt, Mike Hilton, obviously, and I would say DJ Turner has a clear lead in that other cornerback battle with Dax Hill that has seemed to really crystallize over the last few days. The rep disparity, they're continuing to rotate and give Dax opportunities, but certainly seems like it's tilting in DJ Turner's favor. Behind those 3 guys, Dax Hill still going to make the team. Josh Newton's certainly going to make the team. He continues to get work with the ones as well, even though I don't think he's necessarily challenging to start. I think the Bengals coaching staff is just interested in seeing him with that higher level of competition. Then beyond that, do they keep a 5th corner? This is another question. Is Jalen Davis still maintaining his backup slot role, or with Josh Newton getting reps at all the corner spots, are they going to feel comfortable with Josh Newton in that role and go heavier at safety, perhaps? That is one interesting decision. You would think. I think I'm still on 6 corners, James, and Jalen Davis still having a good shot to make the team. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think they'll definitely keep a 6th corner. But what's interesting, and depth chart aside, is do they look at Dejon Anthony? Now we're delving into the safety room and say, oh, we can play him at corner. And we're comfortable playing him at corner. And if so, then it could give you a little flexibility where you're like, all right, well, if he can give you some nickel coverage, you might not need to keep Jalen Davis, who I think they really like and odds are would be the favorite. Or do they really like what they've seen from a Nate Brooks, who they brought in as a veteran, or Alan George, who's obviously been in the system for a while.
And has 2 picks in camp, I think.
2, yeah, has 2 interceptions, and including one this week. So we'll see there. I think preseason is going to kind of determine this, because if you look and you're like, oh, well, Dejon Anthony can be this versatile piece and can play safety if we need him to, but doesn't necessarily disrupt the safety room, and we can, even if he's not listed as a corner, play him at corner and be confident there. Well, then it opens things up a bit. That's all. So we will see, but I do think they go hand in hand. And
I think a clear way we'll get an idea of what they're thinking with Anthony is how he's using these preseason games.
Sure.
Because what we've seen from him, and the notable thing with Dejon Anthony in camp lately, is he's been working in dime packages and as a 3rd safety, bringing a linebacker off the field. They still have corners on the field, and he's maybe got a corner-like responsibility. So if we see him getting more true corner responsibilities in these preseason games, that could give us an idea of what they're thinking.
For sure. And that would be huge as far as roster construction goes. Now, maybe he can't. And then you're talking about Anthony and Tyson Anderson battling it out,
or keeping 5 safeties,
or that, which kind of makes sense. At the same time, only if you think some of those guys can contribute at corner, because corner is just a more important position. It is. And I look at that safety room and I think there's a clear 1-2 when it comes to starting jobs. The Jordan Battle versus Von Bell is not really a battle. I think Battle is firmly number 3.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, is it Tyson Anderson? Is it Dejon Anthony? Does Dax Hill work back in there and that I'm going to cover tight ends and man-to-man situations because he's losing the battle to DJ Turner, which I think we would all agree at this point, which was predictable, by the way. I think DJ was the favorite coming into camp, even though the Bengals wanted to give Dax a shot. And it could change, but as of right now, I think that's a fair wonder. Like, do you keep 5 safeties if you also know that Dax Hill can help in some of those situations?
Yeah. I do think that the DBs in general are pretty interesting. Not a whole lot of starting battles here, though. We'll have to figure out what they want to do at nose tackle. Right now, it's been Chris Jenkins actually working with the ones in the absence of Sheldon Rankins and after McKinley Jackson left practice, especially. But with the ones we've seen, BJ Hill, Chris Jenkins, and Zach Carter as 3 interior linemen when they've gone 5 across on the defensive front with 2 defensive ends as well. So that is one that I think is still a battle. I think the DJ Turner, Dax Hill corner battle has a pretty clear leader, but I wouldn't say it's over. They will have to perform, I think, at some level throughout the rest of the preseason to solidify that. When we get to the specialists, there are 2 very clear ones that we don't really need to talk about. Evan McPherson and Cal Adamitis will continue to maintain their jobs, and they will keep one punter. The question just is which punter, and we'll find out more about what's going on with that battle when we see who punts in preseason game number 1. And as we discussed yesterday, I think we're expecting it to be the 2 undrafted free agents this year that the Bengals have brought in, looking to compete with Brad Robinson.
Yeah, for sure. They're going to compete with Brad, and I think Brad has been impressive, and he's the favorite. And I know a lot of people are going to, and I give the disclaimer every time, roll their eyes or can't believe it, but he's bigger, he's stronger. They like how he's improved this offseason. They told him what to go do this offseason. He did it. Now, at some point, we'll see it in a game. I'm not sure if he'll punt in the preseason. I would assume he's going to punt, or in preseason game number 1. I would assume so, but it's up to these other 2 guys, I think, in Austin McNamara and Ryan Rakow to show, hey, you got to give me some opportunities too in the preseason game to put some film out there. And that's probably what the next few days are going to be about. That's what yesterday was about. Monday's practice was a lot of special teams. So we will see. But yeah, specialists are going to be a big factor in not just the punter battle, also the kickoff return battle, which impacts who they keep at running back potentially. Does Chris Evans beat out Travion Williams? How much does Chase Brown get in the mix on kickoff returns? I think Charlie Jones is going to be the punt returner. I would also put Charlie Jones in on kickoff returns. I think he's pretty set up to succeed there, but they're going to give some of these other guys opportunities as well, and that could sort of decide the running back 3 competition to a certain degree. Like if Travion Williams is head and shoulders above Chris Evans as a kickoff returner as well, Evans has no shot at beating him out. None. But maybe Evans outperforms him in kickoffs and gives himself a real chance to make the team.
Yeah, that would be the path for Evans, certainly. I think there are some clear leaders for the kickoff return job, and it's going to be the rest of those special teams jobs that could be interesting. We saw Jackson Carman, for example, working in one of the key blocking positions in a kickoff return rep where they were rotating guys quite heavily. Chris Jenkins out there in that role as well at some point, just to give you an idea of some of the body types they're trying in that role. And that seemed to be an important one that Darren Simmons is trying to work through. So those kinds of blocking or pursuit, we talked about Cedric Johnson as a kickoff return, kickoff coverage player. Those will have impacts on the roster as well, certainly. Training camp practices resume on Wednesday. James and I will be back down there, and we will bring you our observations, all the latest news, notes, and analysis as the Bengals continue their march to preseason game number 1. That will be coming your way tomorrow. Until then, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.